All right, we're going to get started. Welcome to the Proof of Stake Consensus session of SBC. And we have an amazing lineup of presentations. The first one, everybody heard the phrase, time is money, right? But what that usually means in the traditional financial world is if you can rush fastest to the market infrastructure authority, then you win. And high frequency trading and all of this is all about getting faster. In the first talk, we'll actually talk about how being slower might benefit you. So please, Casper, come to stage and present.
Thank you. Thank you for this time is money introduction. I'll be talking about our paper, Time is Money, Strategic Timing Games in Proof-of-Stake Protocols. And this is joint work with Professor Fahad Saleh from Wake Forest University and Thomas and Barnaby from my colleagues from the Ethereum Foundation, as well as Jennifer and Neha from Jump Crypto. Before jumping into the specifics of timing games, I kind of quickly want to motivate why we should care about them. Consensus protocols are typically evaluated based on their ability to maintain liveness and safety. Liveness being the regular addition of new transactions to the output ledger in a somewhat timely manner, and then safety being the security of those confirmed transactions the security of the transactions remaining in these positions in their respective positions in the ledger. And the thing is, in real-world blockchain protocols, we do also care about something else, namely fairness of economic outcomes amongst consensus participants, because in order to preserve decentralization, essentially. And more specifically, a protocol should be designed to maximize profitability of honest participation. So basically, honest participants should not have any incentives to deviate from the honest protocol. Otherwise, a deviating participant may outcompete the honest peers and then leading to centralization of the validator set slowly over time. And so the problem is that MEV, maximal extractable value, which I will define shortly, frustrates such fairness goals. Maximal extractable value, which I will refer to as MEV going forward, is the value of that consensus participants in their duties as block proposers accrue by selectively including, excluding, and ordering user transactions. So to just give a simple example, if Alice submits a transactions to the public mempool to buy some amount of ETH on a decentralized exchange, Bob may then try an arbitrage to create the same price on a second decentralized exchange in order to recoup that arbitrage profit. And what becomes obvious here is that the order of transactions matters. So if Alice does this trade, Bob really wants to be right after that transaction in order to be able to do that arbitrage to ensure that no one else arbitraged before Bob. And so the order of transaction is of fundamental importance here. And MEV has security implications for consensus protocols and has been studied in the literature in various forms. I'm not going to go into much details, but essentially what I want to get to is actually a different notion of how MEV can impact consensus protocols. And so potential MEV accrues over time as users submit transactions. And the value of the set of these pending transactions therefore increases over time for block proposals. And so the important takeaway here is that as a consequence, time is valuable to consensus participants, which is usually sort of obviated by the assumption of honest versus of an honesty assumption in typical models of consensus. So usually we operate in this honest Byzantine paradigm. And here we're basically, we argue that a model grounded in rational consensus participation provides a more accurate portrayal of behavior in these economically incentivized systems, such as blockchain protocols. And now I want to build some intuition for these timing games. I'm going to be using Ethereum as an example, but we argue in the paper that without loss of generality, for proposed vote type of proof of stake protocols, that these dynamics hold. And so time in Ethereum really just moves forward in these rounds that we call slots. Each slot is 12 seconds long. And then these slots, each slot you have a block, and basically the chain just chugs along. Maybe just a quick side note here that in proof of stake systems, we have this sort of quote unquote deterministic nature of time, where as opposed to proof of work, where we have randomness sort of exogenously fed into the system, here we make, the blockchain makes progress in rounds. That is either of a fixed interval of time, like in Ethereum, or has some notion of timeouts. But these dynamics of what is referred to as deterministic time remain across these proof of stake protocols. And so in a slot, you have typically some duties. And here in Ethereum's case, just to use this as an example, again, without loss of generality, we have at the beginning a block proposal that is supposed to be released at the beginning of the slot, so 0 seconds into the slot. This is taken from the Ethereum protocol specifications. And then we have a committee of attesters voting on these blocks to essentially make them canonical, should they be valid and timely, etc. And so the attesting rule is essentially saying if a valid block shows up, then vote on it immediately as soon as it's heard, or 4 seconds into the slot, whichever comes first. The aggregation part we can sort of skim over. It's a very Ethereum-specific artifact of just stuffing these attestations on chain. But the point here is that we now have the building blocks to kind of have an intuition for what these timing games can look like. So as a block proposer, essentially the proof of stake protocol assigns you this role to propose a block in a given time slot. And for the duration of that time slot, you have, the proposer is given a temporary monopoly. That proposer is the only consensus participant that is able to propose a valid block in that time frame. And so here we see that proposer N is proposing the block slightly late, not exactly at the beginning of the slot, but just slightly late. But it is before the attestation deadline, before the committee basically commits to attesting to whatever they see as the head of the chain. And so what will happen is that this block is proposed slightly late, but early enough for the attesters to see it. And so eventually they will all vote for that block, assuming, of course, the block is valid, etc. And so then eventually block n+1 is built on top of block n, extending the chain, and everything moves on. Now, on the other hand, a block proposer here, a block proposer n+1 here shows up too late. So essentially the block is proposed after the attestation deadline, meaning that the committee votes at the attestation deadline for block n because they haven't seen any block that they could otherwise vote for. And so block n+2 then comes along, skimming over some of the fork choice details that are protocol specific, but will then essentially build on top of block n, as opposed to extending the chain. And so here we begin to see these dynamics of the timing game. Proposers have essentially their reward increasing linearly with time in our model relative to the most recent canonical block, so long as their block eventually becomes canonical. The intuition is simple, that the time difference between the latest canonical block and that proposer's block represents the amount of time that they can capture MEV, and so that is valuable to them, and so their utility function is increasing as linearly in time. And so in terms of dynamics, what this essentially implies is that as a proposer, you want to propose your block as late as possible while still being early enough to become canonical. Attesters, on the other hand, care about different things. They care about being correct, and they care about being fresh. Correctness here essentially means attesters essentially participate in some sort of beauty contest, meaning they want to vote correctly, so they want to vote alongside the majority of the remaining committee. And at the same time, they want to be fresh, meaning that these votes need to be released early enough for the next proposer to see. And the intuition here is that these votes, the information value of these votes degrades over time, and so freshness is of relevance here. And what we see here is this tension between wanting to wait as long as possible to either extract more MEV or have more information here for the attesters, and at the same time the tension to the other side being wanting to make sure to receive these rewards, because there's also a too late notion. And so in this static model that we define in our paper, we essentially have time that is partitioned into slots with a block proposer and a committee of attesters each round. And then proposers essentially choose to extend the chain or not. And they also choose when to release the block. Attesters, on the other hand, they choose when to release the vote for a block, or else they can also vote emptiness. So if a block doesn't show up, you would vote for emptiness. And importantly here, the strategies are static, meaning that all players commit to a schedule of actions at the beginning of the game. And so, yeah, this model is somewhat an idealized description of blockchain consensus mechanisms, especially proposed vote style type of proof-of-stake protocols. And in our paper, we then formally prove and show a multiplicity of equilibria. In fact, there's an infinite amount of equilibria within that time slot. And essentially, the intuition here is that attesters can coordinate to implement proposers acting at any particular time within the time slot. And essentially, the attesters, by choosing a attestation deadline, can force proposers to adhere to that deadline in order to ensure, as the proposer, to still become canonical. But given any attestation deadline, the proposer will release their block as late as possible, given that deadline. And so essentially, any kind of attestation deadline can be in equilibrium within that slot. And the nice takeaway here is that maybe like the equilibrium takeaway here is that, yeah, attesters have the power to force proposers into accepting their attestation deadline. But at the same time, given any deadline, a rational proposer will maximize the delay that they can do while getting away with it, essentially. And so to kind of recap what I walked through until now is that consensus participants are exposed to incentives outside of just the consensus rewards, namely MEV. So you have these exogenous rewards on top of the usual consensus rewards that influence their decision-making process. And so, importantly, time is valuable to consensus participants. And what this means is that block proposers then find themselves incentivized to use their temporary monopoly power by engaging in these strategic timing games. And these timing games, however, as just mentioned, can be contained but not fully stopped by the committee of attesters. And we care about this because ensuring economic fairness among consensus participants is critical to preserving the decentralization of the validator set. And we then argue in the paper that rational consensus participation provides a more accurate portrayal of behavior in economically incentivized systems such as blockchain protocols. This now kind of concludes the first part of the paper, which is this model. Obviously, you will find a lot more detail in the proofs in the paper, so please do read the paper. But now I'm going to shift to the empirical analysis. And essentially, we looked at some data on the Ethereum network to establish whether these timing games are being played by consensus participants and to what extent, if they are being played. To get there, I want to briefly take a step back and talk about this concept of proposer-builder separation, of which MEV Boost can be seen as an instantiation. Essentially, the MEV market structure in Ethereum has dramatically evolved over the last couple of years, and we find that now there's a set of specialized actors in producing blocks, and the high-level idea is that finding these MEV opportunities is a complex task. And a proposer may not be able to find these MEV opportunities. And so the proposer-builder separation refers to this idea of the proposer auctioning off the right to build the block to a builder. And now I want to quickly walk through these different sets of actors that participate in this network. So there's still the usual user transactions that are submitted to the public mempool. Then there's these actors that are referred to as searchers that look for these MEV opportunities. So, for example, arbitrages, and submit bundles of transactions alongside bids to express their order preference to block builders. Block builders, in turn, specialize in packing maximally profitable blocks using these searcher bundles and other available user transactions from the public mempool as input. And they submit these blocks with bids to relays. Relays, on the other hand, sort of act as a trust facilitator between block builders and block proposers. And what they do is they validate these blocks received by block builders and forward only valid headers to the block proposers. And this ensures that block proposers cannot steal the content of these block builders block, but they can still commit to proposing this block by signing the respective block header. And so essentially, the problem is the following. A block builder may not trust a block proposer, because if they would just send the block content to a proposer, then the proposer could just sort of steal the MEV opportunities. And so these relays act as a kind of broker between these two actors. And then essentially at the end of the day, the proposer can choose to either participate in this block auction or locally build a block, just like always, essentially. And maybe an interesting note here is that over 90% of all Ethereum validators run this MEV Boost software, which is essentially participating in this proposer-builder separation paradigm. And so what we did is we we looked at some data using data points from the ultrasound relay, which is one of these relays, and essentially they recorded these block builder bits, and so we collected over 150 million bits over just over a month earlier this year, and had data for over roughly 185,000 slots, and of those were 85,000 winning slots. And for each bit, there's several timestamps that the relay records that we can use to understand the dynamics of these timing games. And so what we see here is a logical representation of the block production process for slot n. So the builder bits begin streaming in during slot n-1, after which the proposer and the relay interact through like requests and responses to finally then release a block. And this kind of competitive process between block builders determines the right to construct the block for slot n and secures sort of potential MEV-derived profits. And so for each bit, the relay records some timestamps at which the bit was received, so the received at, when it's eligible, so once the block has been, the bit and the block has been verified, and then eventually the proposer goes to the relay and requests a header, and if that header, meaning if the bit is the highest that they have seen from all the different relays that a proposer may connect to, they will sign that header and return it to the relay with the get payload call, and then eventually, once that signed header is returned, the relay releases the block and sends it to the P2P layer as well as the proposer. And so the natural question we asked is like, what is the value of time? And so the marginal value of time that we find here is that we basically looked at all the bits submitted to the relay over time, and here we plotted the bits over time against the median bit value of these builders. And importantly, we observe a linear relationship here, meaning that a rational actor is incentivized to participate in these timing games. We ran a regression and we found a value of 0.0065 ETH per second, which roughly translates to $10 a second for the median proposer. So if you delay your block by some amount of time, you can essentially earn more due to these MEV dynamics. And so then this shows that there exists a positive marginal value of time, indicating that a rational block proposer would participate in timing games. And so then we kind of tried to understand whether these timing games are played now that they're rational to participate in. And to do that, we looked at some different timestamps of winning bits now. Not all bits, but only winning bits. So bits that eventually were signed by a proposer and are essentially the block that a proposer released. And so what we see here is that the received time of winning bits is very close to the actual proposer schedule, so 0 seconds into the slot. Shortly after, they're eligible, and with a bit of a delay, they are then eventually signed. And what this indicates is, although the block is released relatively late, not as late as it possibly could, but still roughly like 780 milliseconds into the slot, a lot of this is actually due to signing delays, meaning that the block proposer, while releasing their block with a delay of roughly 800 milliseconds, most of it is not actually, they're not able to capture the MEV of 800 milliseconds more listening time, but it's a time differential only between the received timestamp and the signed timestamp. So we did a bit more empirical analysis than in the paper to show that this is due to signing procedures of certain proposer types, namely actually centralized exchanges, funnily enough. And now quickly to speak about some of the conclusions and implications. The high-level takeaway is timing games are rational to engage in, and they do occur, but they are not yet stretched to their fullest possible extent. And so on the model side, what's good is that testers can enforce an equilibrium strategy containing these timing games, but on the other hand, proposers are still able to maximally delay their blocks any given attestation deadline. And proposers can also delay their blocks better through sophisticated latency optimizations. Speaking to your comment regarding the high-frequency trading centralized version. And so this is important because economic fairness among consensus participants is of great utmost importance in real-world blockchain protocols in order to preserve decentralization. And to further recap the entirety of this talk, maybe the takeaway here should maybe be that time is valuable to consensus participants, and block proposers are, in fact, incentivized to abuse their monopoly power by engaging in these strategic timing games. And then they can be contained by attesters, as mentioned, and this is important because of the goal of preserving decentralization, and so modeling rational consensus participation arguably provides a more accurate portrayal of behavior in these economically incentivized systems. Obviously, a whole lot more detail in the paper, proofs, more analysis on the empirical side, and as a side note, this paper is forthcoming in the AFT conference later this year. And yeah, the QR code is the link to the paper. Thank you so much. Do we have time for questions?
Yeah, so we have time for questions. Please queue up behind the mics so that people online can hear. I'm going to use my latency advantage and ask a quick question. What is the main source that you find for the delay advantage? Is it that fees increase? Is it the time I have to process and get the best, to search and get the best built block? What is the advantage of delay? What is the source of delaying, of the benefit of delaying? Is it that fees keep increasing or more orders are increasing?
I mean, generally, the more time a proposer has, the more transactions will be in the public mempool, and so the more options to sort the transactions in a particular way to extract these MEV opportunities are found.
So it's not the processing time of the existing pool, it's the growth of the mempool?
It's the growth of the mempool, yeah.
And is it the fees? The more time, the more desperate I am to get my transaction, so I will bid higher fees? Or is it more market-based?
It's to some extent, towards the end of the slot, you might have better ways to arbitrage between centralized exchanges and decentralized exchanges with a decrease in risk. But at the same time, so there's like several factors going on. But I would say the main source is just having more choice, more transactions to optimize from.
All right, we have a bunch of questions.
Thank you so much for the talk. Quick question. From this research, what do you think is the takeaway for proposer boost? And what do you think the 40% number could be changed up or down based on the research you have here?
So what exactly is the question? So proposer boost, yes. I mean, that's like very specific Ethereum fork choice quirks that are there to kind of make the protocol more secure to prevent reorgs and balancing attacks. I think Joachim, the next speaker, will hint at that. But yeah, so what
what do you think the additional learnings are from this paper around Proposer Boost?
I mean, Proposer Boost essentially helps. So in Ethereum, Proposer Boost is essentially what it says is it gives fork choice weight to a block proposal if it shows up on time. And the boost is 40% of the committee weight. So if a proposal shows up on time, the testers will assign that block 40% weight. And so if a block proposer in, say, slot n+1, they can basically use the boost to try and reorg block n if they don't manage to accumulate 40% of the votes. So it's essentially, it helps the next block proposer to reorg late blocks that don't show up early enough to accumulate enough attestations. So it's essentially a late block reorging mechanism, if you will. If that makes, I mean, it's very specific Ethereum fork choice stuff, but I'm not sure if that answers your question.
No, but it's okay, thank you.
All right, why don't we take the remainder of the questions offline?
Okay.
And thanks, Casper. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And next up is Joachim, and arguably the second most important thing we've all have been waiting for this year. The first one is the merge, and the second one is to have actually a safe and live algorithm for Ethereum 2.0, and Joachim will present Goldfish.
Thank
Take
you.
it away.
All right, let's see. This works. This works. And this works. Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. And let's get started. Yeah, I'm going to present to you Goldfish. The paper is now titled No More Attacks on Proof-of-Stake Ethereum. There used to be a question mark in the title. You'll see why. Anyway, this is a joint work with our collaborator Francesco from the Ethereum Foundation, with my colleague Nusret, and with our advisor David Che, who's here. And let's get started. So, you know, the elephant in the room, or what Dalia just mentioned, you know, the big event that happened about a year ago in September 2022, nobody could ignore it, the merge, finally. Ethereum switches to proof of stake. And there's a very natural question related to this. Okay, we're switching from proof of work, Nakamoto-style consensus, to a brand new proof of stake consensus protocol. Is this protocol secure? So we asked ourselves this question in 2020, about 2.5 years earlier, when this paper appeared on Archive called Combining Ghost and Casper. You know, short, we refer to this protocol as Gasper. And that's really, in some sense, you know, the foundation of the proof-of-stake Ethereum protocol as we see it today. And so the question is this protocol secure? That's how we started this. And you know, here's the subtle hint that Casper was already announcing. Shortly thereafter, we found some issues with the protocol. Basically, there was a balancing attack on this protocol. Other people have been doing analysis of the protocol, found some other kind of nasty behavior that the protocol shows. The earlier versions of this attack were in, you know, a model that had adversarial network delay, but it turns out you can have the same balancing type attacks even in networks where, you know, the adversary doesn't control anything about the network. And the result of these attacks is that the protocol doesn't have liveness, the protocol doesn't have safety, even if the adversary controls relatively little stake. And in addition, you can use the techniques of these attacks in order to get reorgs. And if you want to read more, you can check out this paper called 3 Attacks on Proof-of-Stake Ethereum. And then there was the infamous Proposer Boost applied or put into the protocol in response to this. Unfortunately, you know, this was also a little bit hinted to. The Proposer Boost makes certain types of selfish mining and reorgs easier. And it turns out that it was also not enough to make these balancing attacks go away because there were other vectors in the protocol that could bring them back, basically. There's a paper titled 2 More Attacks on Proof-of-Stake Ethereum, which you can check out. And then there was a change to the protocol again in order to, make these attack vectors go away. And then we merged. So this is the protocol we have. Unfortunately, this process, whack-a-mole of between security researchers and security designers is not a process that we're very happy with. And so Goldfish is kind of in this line of work, the idea of can we have a protocol where we can be sure that there will be no more attacks on proof-of-stake Ethereum, and can we give a security proof, meaning can we give a description of the exact circumstances that would have to be satisfied for this protocol to be a secure protocol? So this is kind of the setting that this work is to be understood in. And now many of you probably know, hey, wait, we have proof-of-stake protocols for which we have a security proof. Think of, Nakamoto-style, Ouroboros, for example, or PBFT-style protocols like Hotstuff. Why don't we just use those? And the answer is, well, for Ethereum, we're shooting after a very ambitious wish list of properties that none of these earlier protocols really satisfies. And I'm going to go through a couple of them. The first one we call dynamic participation. What we mean by this is the protocol should tolerate a large number of unexpected temporary crash faults. The idea being, for example, if for some reason some proposers or some validators decide to not vote for certain blocks because they don't like the content, or if there's a bug in some of the clients and some of the clients basically go offline, as has happened earlier in the year, then we still want the protocol to make some sort of progress. So that's dynamic participation. A second property we can call accountability, which means that we want to be able to slash malicious validators. In particular, whenever there's a safety violation, an inconsistency in the protocol, we want to be able to hold a sizable fraction of them accountable and take away their stake. The next property is a little bit, relatively straightforward, right? We want this protocol to be communication efficient, of course, so that we can support 1 million validators. We would like this protocol to be reorg resilient. By that, we mean that if there's an honest validator, playing no shenanigans, everything good, makes a proposal, an honest proposal, there should not be an adversarial strategy to prevent that proposal from entering the chain, together with kind of the prefix that is basically built on. And then finally, I think this one is also a relatively intuitive one. We want fast confirmation, right? We want to confirm transactions as quickly as possible, really. And by the end of the talk, you'll see a protocol that actually has all of these properties. But going back to the protocols that I just talked about, right, the ones that we had a security proof previously, longest chain style protocols, they get dynamic participation and they have low communication complexity, but they do not get accountability. They're not reorg resilient, and they do not have fast confirmation. They're notorious for their slow confirmation, in fact. And PBFT-style protocols, they have accountability, they can be made reorg resilient, they have relatively fast confirmation, but they don't work under dynamic participation, and they're not really communication efficient. So somehow, we're trying to square the circle here. And in fact, for these two properties alone, dynamic participation and accountability, you can show based on the CAP theorem that there cannot be one single log, one single ledger that has both of these properties at all times. So the question is, okay, if we cannot have one ledger that has these properties, can we at least, some users might prefer one property, some users might prefer the other. Can we at least have a protocol where we leave the choice to the user? And I'll explain a little more what that means. So here's kind of the, Ethereum consensus protocol in one block diagram, really. So Ethereum consensus is this box here, right? Transactions enter. And really, the box is composed of two protocols, of two sub-protocols. The first one is called LMD Ghost. It produces a ledger or a log, this orange log here, and that's what you see in your clients as the chain tip. And then, based on the chain tip, there's this second stage protocol, which many of you have probably heard of. It's called Casper FFG, and it checkpoints this chain tip in order to produce finalizations. And then these finalizations are fed back into LMD Ghost in order to make sure that these two protocols kind of don't diverge too far. Okay. Now, how is this useful? Right now we have a protocol that takes in transactions, but it gives us two output logs. What does that mean? We have a chain tip, we have finalizations. How should we deal with those? What should we follow? And the idea here is the following. We'll have the chain tip be a full log that has this dynamic participation availability property, right? So the full log is secure even if there are many temporary crash faults, and as long as among the nodes that aren't crashed, a majority of them is honest. And then the Casper FFG gadget will finalize a certain prefix of that chain tip. So there will be a certain prefix, a certain portion of the output log that will be made accountable. And that means the prefix log is accountably secure, meaning that it's live as long as fewer than a third of the validators are malicious. And if there was ever an inconsistency with the finalizations, we can point to a third of the validators who must have provably violated the protocol. And then these two are also consistent. This is what is referred to as the ebb and flow property. And how is this useful? Well, now we're giving this control back to the client, right? If the client is selling boba and is not really concerned that somebody would, mount a double spend or a safety attack, then, but on the other hand, you want to be in business, you want to make sure you can always transact, then you would probably consider a transaction confirmed once it enters, the chain, essentially the orange part of the log. And if you're selling something very expensive, or maybe you're a centralized exchange and you have like a big deposit, and you want to make sure that the payment is absolutely not reverted, for example, you're selling a car, then you would wait for the transaction to be finalized. So great, users can now decide again, right? So there's a paper also for ebb and flow protocols if you want to learn more about this. Now with this construction, the issues that have been there in the past, they basically fall into two categories. One is related to kind of this feedback loop, the interaction between the two protocols. That's not the primary topic of this talk. The topic of this talk is issues with this first stage protocol, with this LMD Ghost protocol. And you can see why does this matter? Well, you could take the stance and say, well, why do I care about LMD Ghost? I'm only following these finalizations. If LMD Ghost doesn't work, why do I care? But the point here is, you see everything in this diagram is downstream from LMD Ghost. If LMD Ghost doesn't do what you expect it to do, you get basically, almost no properties, right? You get accountability, you get accountable safety, but your finalizations might just never finalize anything, really, if the first stage protocol doesn't work. That's why it's so important, excuse me, that we make the first stage protocol work. Okay, so, then previous works have suggested a fairly similar construction where they just replace the LMD Ghost protocol with a longest chain protocol. And then if we look at the wish list of properties that we want, this construction manages to kind of combine these two main properties that, we had to work around the impossibility of combining them. This construction also gets you a fairly communication efficient protocol because longest chain is communication efficient and the votes in Casper FFG can still be drawn out across like a whole epoch. But longest chain is not reorg resilient and longest chain is slow in confirming, and so you do not get these two properties. Now what we would like to do is we would like to design a drop-in replacement for this LMD, for LMD Ghost or for the longest chain in this construction, where we have, the drop-in replacement gives us dynamic participation. It is communication efficient. But it also needs to have the reorg resilience and the fast confirmation. It's clear if you want to have fast confirmation, Casper is definitely slow, so finalizations are going to be slow. The only hope you can have for fast confirmation is if it happens in the tip. That's why this first stage protocol needs to have this property. And similarly for reorgs, right? The proposals that are or are not reorged are the proposals of this protocol. The checkpointing mechanism, just adds a little safety on top. It just checkpoints this. But okay, so this gives us, the desiderata that we want for a drop-in replacement for LMD Ghost, which is safety and liveness under dynamic participation. For those of you who are a little more familiar with the literature, we mean the sleepy model, reorg resilience, fast confirmation, and low communication. And then in order for this to have, utility as a drop-in replacement and a realistic path to adoption, we want this to be composable with Casper FFG, and we want it to be similar to the protocol we already have, LMD Ghost. Okay, and now the second half of the talk is about, how do we design this protocol? So let's look at LMD Ghost and kind of what's wrong with it. And in LMD Ghost, time is divided in slots, right? And I'm going to say for simplicity that every slot is 2 delta, where delta is the upper bound that we know on the message delay. Okay, so we're assuming that we're in a synchronous setting here because any sort of asynchrony, network partitions, etc., we've already delegated over to Casper FFG. We can afford now, we want this to work only in the synchronous setting. And the protocol is fairly simple, actually. For every slot, we assume there's some sort of proof-of-stake lottery process that gives us a block proposer and a bunch of voters. Okay? And what do they do? At the beginning of the slot, the proposer runs this thing called fork choice and proposes a block. What's this thing called fork choice? It's every validator has in their head a block tree and a bunch of votes. And then they run this ghost rule. And ghost works as follows. You start at the genesis block, and then for every child block, you look at the number of votes in the respective subtree. So in this case, for example, on the left-hand side, this is 4 votes. On the right-hand side, it's 3 votes. And so you recurse into the subtree that has the most votes. And you keep doing that until you reach a leaf. And then the proposer makes a proposal and sends it out to everybody. And then delta time later, this proposal has propagated to all the voters. And the voters, again, run the fork choice rule. If everything goes well, they arrive, they determine as the chain tip the newly proposed block, and then they cast a vote on that newly proposed block. Now, what's the issue with this? The issue with this is, we could call it swaying voters. The issue is as follows. Suppose the proposal has been made, but just before the voters are about to vote, the adversary releases a few votes from like a previous slot on some kind of orphan blocks in order to confuse honest validators about what's the leading chain, what's the chain tip that they should be voting for. And then some of them might consider the proposal the leading chain, and some of them might consider another block the leading chain. And then they will vote inconsistently. Some of them will vote on, in this case, on the left-hand side, and some of them will vote on the right-hand side. And it can happen that then the proposal doesn't get enough votes, even though it's an honest proposal, and it gets reorged out. So this gives you reorgs, and then you can bootstrap from there to these balancing attacks. So this is what we want to solve. And that's what Goldfish essentially does. And I'm going to give you, it's going to be a little bit more technical. We have 9 minutes left, so that shall suffice for that. But I hope you at least get kind of the intuition from it. So in Goldfish, again, we have time slots, just like in LMD Ghost. We're adding 1 phase. So instead of having 2 phases, we now have 3 phases, all of them delta apart. In Ethereum, that would mean the delta there is 4 seconds. So instead of going from 12 seconds, we would go to 16 seconds. And then for every slot, again, we assume that there's a proposer and that there's a voter committee, and those are given to us from proof of stake. And then every validator maintains 2 data structures. One is a buffer, BI, and one is a block vote tree, TI. And whenever a validator receives a message throughout the protocol, they first just put it into BI. But whenever they run Ghost fork choice, they apply it to TI. And much of the magic has to do with how do messages go from BI to TI in this protocol. Okay, so keep an eye out for this. In particular, there are two mechanisms. One we call vote buffering or view merge, and the other one we call vote expiry. And the mechanisms work as follows. So at the beginning of the slot, there's again the proposer. And the proposer does the following. The proposer of the slot does the following. It takes its buffer and adds whatever it has in its buffer to its tree. And then it runs this ghost rule that we have just seen, but only using the votes from the most recent slot. So only using the votes from slot T-1. That is the vote expiry. The first aspect is this vote buffering thingy going on. And then the proposer adds a new block, right, at the ghost tip and proposes its block vote tree. So it just sends out its entire view of the protocol. There is a way to make this efficient so that the actual message that happens on the network is not as big and it's not as horrible as it sounds here in the pseudocode. You can check out the details in the paper. And then delta time later, right, this has propagated to everybody. And the voters, they take this proposed block vote tree and they merge it into their local tree. And then again, they run this ghost rule, and they using the slot T-1 votes, and they cast a vote themselves, which they broadcast to everybody. And then in the third phase, at the beginning of the third phase, every validator takes their buffer and adds it to their tree. Now, this protocol has two interesting properties that immediately basically give you the security and the reorg resilience of it. The first one is that, okay, we want to show reorg resilience, right? So we can assume that, suppose the leader of a certain slot is honest, we want to show that all the slot T honest voters will vote for this proposal. Okay, so this is basically the property that is violated in these swaying attacks, right? There was an honest proposal, but not all the honest voters voted for it. So how does this property come about? So, this is kind of the view of the protocol from the perspective of a bunch of validators, right? And let's suppose there is this swaying attack. So there is one validator here on the left that has seen these votes that the adversary has released. The other ones haven't seen those. And we're now at this point in time where this arrow is, okay? So suppose by this point in time, this node here has seen these sway votes. Well, they now see this as the leading chain. The other guy see another leading chain. But the point is that according to the protocol description, there's no update from TI in this window for this validator, unless it's the proposer, but let's not assume that for now. So they must have received these sway votes before this deadline. And so come this proposal, the beginning of the proposal phase, the proposer, everybody else now has these sway votes in their buffer. Not in their tree yet, but in their buffer. In particular, the proposer has it in their buffer. Now what the proposer does, suppose this guy is the proposer adds the buffer to their tree, right? Happens here, and then they make a new proposal. And then they send out this proposal. But now notice you have the property that the tree that the proposer has and that the proposer sends out is a superset of all the other honest validators' tree. And then what happens once that proposal propagates to everybody and all the honest voters merge that proposal into their tree is that now everybody has the same tree. And now if everybody runs the ghost rule, they all agree on what they should be voting for. So that is the property that vote buffering gives us. It's if the leader in a particular slot is honest, then all slot T honest voters will vote for the proposal of that leader. Now we need to make sure that, it has happened once, it needs to happen, forever, right? So we want the second property, which is that if in slot T, or in T-1, honest voters vote into a certain subtree rooted at B, that they then also do that in the next slot. Why is that? So let's assume this, right? Let's assume that in slot T-1, all honest voters have voted for some block that is a descendant of a block B. But let's suppose for contradiction that there is one honest voter that is not voting into that subtree B in the next time slot. Why is that not possible? Well, because of vote expiry, right? The only votes that matter in the ghost rule are the votes from the most recent time slot. In the most recent time slot, all the honest guys have voted into B. That means into this blue tree, this competing tree, only the adversary can have cast votes. But by assumption, the honest guys are more than the adversary. So definitely B will win out in the ghost rule, and the honest node will cast their vote into B. Okay, and now we just have to tie it all up, right? We need a confirmation rule for this protocol, which is that we output a block once its prefix, a block and its prefix once it is tconf time old, and still on the ghost tip according to the most recent non-expired votes. And then we get reorg resilience, right? Honest proposals enter the confirmed output log with the same prefix as determined at the time of proposal. Why is that? Well, the proposer was honest. We saw that in the time slot of the proposal, all honest guys have voted for it. In all the subsequent time slots, also all honest voters will vote for this proposal. So the proposal will forever stay in the ghost chain, and it'll be eventually output according to this confirmation rule. And then it's easy to get security from this, to get safety and liveness from this. Namely, we just have to tune this confirmation parameter such that we can make sure that within every tconf interval, there was at least one honest proposer throughout the execution. And then we trust the fact that honest proposals stabilize the prefix, they introduce new transactions, and so that gives us safety and liveness. Good. That's basically the protocol. Here are the theorems. Since then, there has been some follow-up work. So one of the challenges that comes with this protocol is that vote expiry means the protocol becomes more brittle if there was a temporary network partition or a temporary spike in network latency. Vote expiry gives us also a bunch of good properties, but this is a bad property. And so an idea in follow-up work is that what about instead of expiring votes after one slot, we expire them after k slots. Then what you get is a little bit of a trade-off between dynamic participation and asynchrony resilience, right? If you want to tolerate longer violations of the delay bound, you have to give up a little bit on the level of dynamic participation that you can tolerate. But the result of this is this protocol called RLMD Ghost of Luca and Francesco, which will be presented tomorrow. So you should make it to the 10 a.m. slot and check that out. And with that, I conclude. You're seeing Goldfish. You've seen these three properties, safety and liveness under dynamic participation, reorg resilience, and hopefully you're convinced that it's quite similar to LMD Ghost. Properties that I haven't shown you, but that you can find in the paper, is that this protocol is also composable with FFG. It has fast confirmations, assuming the optimistic case that participation is high. And it can be made to have low communication because we can subsample the voting committees within Goldfish. And we have a kind of a proof of concept simulation / toy implementation and a bunch of experiments, which you can also check out in the paper. And yeah, if we plug Goldfish into this checkpointing construction here, then what you will get is a protocol that ticks all of these boxes. Thank you.
All right, we have time for maybe one quick question.
So one quick question then. So first, I'm happy to see that you also like fish names for your papers. But so this protocol is synchronous, but then you put it into the big box there, and there is a claim for partial synchrony, right? Is that correct? So is it also responsive? Namely, do your validators need to wait for a delta before advancing to the next protocol step?
Yes.
Okay.
So this protocol, the Goldfish itself is not responsive.
Cool.
And then as a result of that, the checkpointing is not responsive.
Cool. And could you use the Scholl trick to make it responsive by saying, I just advance at network speed, whatever, and if I realize that I do lose liveness, in that case, I start waiting for the deltas?
I guess you could try. We haven't thought about that. Yeah.
Cool.
Would
Thanks.
be worth thinking about.
All right, so maybe one more quick question, if there is one. All right, I'll ask, when is Ethereum going to roll this?
Well, we'll see. So I think there's like an ongoing process kind of towards doing more and more work on the consensus protocol. So this RLMD Ghost is kind of fixing some of the kind of asynchrony resilience. And then there's a proposal for single slot finality, which is my understanding is basically built on RLMD Ghost. So there the idea is to basically run this finality gadget in faster. So we're probably not going to see Goldfish as it's like specified in the paper deployed, but it seems that the ideas continue to live and continue to evolve, and we'll see. Yeah.
Fair enough. All right.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Joachim, again. Okay, and the next speaker, Oysin, who comes from OBOL. And we've already addressed MEV, we've already addressed consensus in this session. What remains is the staking and all this work to decentralize and scale proof of stake consensus aims to increase the security by having many stakers. But of course, what we have is node operators organizing and coordinating all the stakers into essentially somewhat centralized control entity. And I guess Oysin will tell us about how to decentralize the validators back again. Take it away.
Sweet. Is the thing on? Okay. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. My name is Oshin, and today I'm going to be talking to you about building a secure and decentralized proof-of-stake consensus for Ethereum. So if I give a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about, this talk is going to be focused on distributed validators and distributed validator protocol. Going to do a bit of an introduction to them and what they're for. And then I'm going to go into the DV protocol and different decisions we can take to make it secure and decentralized. So I'm going to look at some of the engineering and software architecture sides. Then we're going to look at like the data and subjectivity challenges of proving DVs. Then we're going to look at some of the open research items. And then lastly, going to talk about some of the like coordination and public coordination side. Before I get into it too quickly, I wanted to briefly kind of give you guys a mental model as to where DVs fit in scaling Ethereum. So Ethereum and most blockchains have kind of three things that you want to try and scale: execution, data, and consensus. To scale execution, the most common way to do so is with optimistic and ZK rollups. To scale the data side of a blockchain, things like data availability sampling is used. Common ones are EigenDA, Polygon Avail, Celestia, Danksharding, and so on. And to scale consensus, we think distributed validator technology is the next way to take like an order of magnitude improvement in scaling consensus. So I've mentioned this thing, distributed validators. What are they? A distributed validator is an Ethereum validator with software-based fault tolerance. You can think of it like a multi-sig, but for an Ethereum validator, one where you need kind of more than 2/3 of people online and honest. So what's interesting about them as well is because they are Byzantine fault tolerant, you can have multiple independent parties work together to run one single validator. Why would you want to do something like this? Who's this useful for? One of the first and foremost things is if you have fault tolerance, you can have a highly available validator, meaning one that runs on multiple machines, and if any one machine dies, no big deal. Validator stays online. Having multiple independent entities running your validator is something important for lots of like liquid staking protocols and people that want to delegate their stake to somewhere else. They want to make sure that it's actually run by independent people and not one person like kind of messing up can get you kind of slashed. For the home staker and the solo staker, the ability to run in teams and to do like squad staking is something that's enabled by distributed validators. And generally having multiple client implementations in a single validator, having multiple geographies in a single validator, things like this increase Ethereum's resilience, as we alluded to with, like in the previous talk about if there's a client failure, a DV that's made up of like many different clients isn't going to go offline. So if that's what a distributed validator is, just to briefly give you an idea as to their like progression at the moment, distributed validators have been a topic of research since about 2019. As of the end of 2022, we've put the first one on mainnet. At the moment, OBOL is in alpha phase, and we have about 40 operators running validators on mainnet and as part of alpha. We're working with projects like Lido to run DVs on mainnet. We have solo stakers running DVs on mainnet with EtherFi. We've been doing like scaling and performance tests with Mega Labs, where we ran up to 3K validators on 4 bare metal machines. We've done a security assessment with Sigma Prime, and we're currently working on audit for some Solidity. So if that's what a distributed validator is, what is a distributed validator protocol? A distributed validator protocol is just, at its most simple, a spec that many different client teams have implemented that allows them all to interoperate and work together. A protocol like this is one that should focus on being secure whenever there's a trade-off. It should focus on verifiability, so we can figure out, who's taking part in a DV. And generally, it's the kind of base layer for proving participation in a DV, and then subsequently like rewarding and penalizing people if they're participating honestly or if they're not participating enough. So that's a quick run through on what DVs are and what a distributed validator protocol is. Now I want to talk about some of the challenges faced, and most of this talk will have more questions than it will answers. But the reason I wanted to start with the engineering side is I wanted to talk about private keys and networking. So proof-of-stake validators have private keys. That is, the kind of crown jewels, the most important thing in them. And when you look at a distributed validator, the first question to ask is, what's up with the private keys? So because BLS, the signature scheme, is homomorphically additive, that's a fancy way of saying you can add together signatures from 2 different pub keys so long as they're signing the same piece of data. This is very important for distributed validators because it means you can build a distributed validator that only has to do 2 things. It has to come to consensus on what every validator signs, and then once it receives a signature back, it has to aggregate them together into an aggregate signature that it can send upwards to the wider consensus layer network and look like a normal signature. What's interesting is it does not need to have runtime access to the private keys. It does not need to be able to sign messages. And what's important about this is you can separate the concern of controlling the private keys, not slashing any messages. That can stay with the validator. And then the distributed validator can mostly focus on coming to consensus on what should be signed and aggregating what comes back. And to put this in clarity as to what this mitigates for, if distributed validator software was compromised, like Lazarus Group was in charge, they're showing slashable messages to the downstream validators. The downstream validator says, I've already signed something for this slot height. I'm just not going to produce another signature. So even if you've total control, you don't get slashed, you go offline. And these liveness risks we'll talk about later on. One of the other things that's important about the private keys is you can do a distributed key generation rather than centrally creating the private keys. This is where all of the different operators in a distributed validator take part in the key creation process, and no one entity has the full private key. If you're then trying to slash this validator, you probably have to compromise 2/3 of the operators to get a full private key so you can sign something slashable. So that's the kind of private key side of a distributed validator and how you can build such a protocol without runtime access to the keys. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is the networking side. So in blockchains, we regularly favor these gossip-based networks, which gossip messages to many parties, all kind of in a one-to-many situation. This is not the route we've gone with for networking for distributed validators for a few reasons. Firstly, a multi-hop gossip network slows you down. If you have to kind of hop along from computer to computer, that wastes precious time when you're trying to run a validator and not be slower than a normal one. And it's also going to a lot of parties that don't exactly need that partial signature. Regularly with gossip networks, you need people to run message brokers that are accessible to all and will kind of rebroadcast your messages. If you don't, you kind of have issues where messages don't get to their intended recipients. And generally, if you have this big gossip network that everybody shares, you have to make sure that it's kind of homogeneous. You don't break it with a new version that changes how messages are formatted. That can cause a partition, or worse, it can cause messages to halt entirely. And as a result, your kind of protocol becomes very homogeneous and all has to upgrade at the same time. And if you're making a protocol and you want to design something that's very like non-correlated, you don't want this big network that everyone speaks that like all serializes the same way. That's kind of something that'll succeed together or fail together, which is not really what you want when you're building a DV protocol. Instead, we've gone with independent networks for each cluster, so each kind of set of nodes that are running with one another. You know your counterparties because they have the other pieces of your private key, so the messages you're sending are like only to the intended recipients. We've built on libp2p, which uses like a circuit relay, which is more or less a man in the middle that helps you find your counterparties and helps you do NAT hole punching, which is a way for you to speak directly to your counterparty with a key exchange, so you're like doing end-to-end encrypted comms. So if you're an adversary like in control of the network trying to like filter out this like communication, it can be very hard to do because it just looks like any other encrypted communication between peers. I would say that networking is by no means like a finished or a solved problem. Some of the things we also look at are using something like QUIC instead of TCP, and also doing decentralized discovery rather than having these relays that help you find one another. That's something that I'm keen to hear about more at CADemiliaCon later in the week. But yeah, on the engineering front, the two main takeaways I'd like you to kind of think about is you can build a distributed validator that doesn't have access to the private keys. It's only aggregating signatures from something else that guards the kind of crown jewels. And networking, if you have all of these clusters with independent networks, you can upgrade one in its own time, see if it goes like successfully or not, then upgrade all of the other clusters. You're not in this kind of one big like homogeneous network that either like succeeds or fails all at the same time. So next, on the data front, data is quite a large part of distributed validators, and I want to go back to actually where they were first kind of introduced to the Ethereum space in a talk at DevCon by Donkrad Feist and Carl Beek around trustless validators, the trustless staking pools in ETH2. So in 2019, this was around the time that the ETH2 spec picked up the BLS signature scheme, and they had this new homomorphic additivity to play with. And this is where they realized you could do these like distributed validators. However, the problem that they kind of foresaw and spent most of the time in the talk talking about is how do you penalize the lazy validator? The one that's offline, or the one that's running on underpowered resources, the one that's kind of not running any EL or CL at all and is just pretending to agree with what everyone else says. This is what we call the like lazy validator problem. And the short answer is there's no magic bullet for kind of knowing, is this person honest and far away, or are they nearby and running on like an under-resourced node or something? There's been lots of research in the space, including the like proof of custody work that the original ETH2 spec considered, and we're doing some interesting work with verifiable delay functions and delay towers at the moment, trying to use VDFs as a way to prove access to the fresh beacon state, being like, yep, I definitely had beacon state at the right time because I have like all of these VDFs to prove that I couldn't have kind of caught up in time. On this front, trying to come up with some objective measure of who's online and who's offline is an interesting game, one that there's no kind of like perfect answer for, but if you can get with something relatively objective, you can use that as the base layer for like rewarding and penalizing people on top of it, which is kind of what I'm getting to in the next slide, which is if you have this proof of participation, how do you then get this to L1 where the like validator rewards are being streamed to? If you were, for example, to publish this data once a month, that's a known drag on rewards. It's kind of like a pretty fixed cost. You'll end up being, making less rewards than a normal validator, which is not something we want to do. If you do the same thing but on an L2, you still have to pay the call data costs of kind of getting your call data published, still have kind of an overhead. If you do something purely like fraud-based, where you only kind of report and hit the chain when somebody's offline for like a minimum floor, that's not bad. It becomes cheaper, but it still sets a minimum bound on when you can be offline and like no one can like report you, because reporting you costs more money than you might be slashed or penalized. But some of the ones that we're also looking at that I find frankly interesting are state channels. You have long-lived counterparties here running a well-known protocol, so there is a decent argument to be said that you can do all of this opening and closing of a state channel like in the happy path, all off-chain, never hitting it. But some of the other things we are looking at is, when you do show up on chain to claim it back, are you closing a state channel? Are you giving a BLS signature? Are you giving a ZK proof? None of these are all like super cheap, so there's always going to be trade-offs involved, but figuring out a protocol that's succinctly provable or like in an affordable manner provable on chain is kind of a decent part of this like distributed validator protocol work. So that's some of the engineering and then the data sides of things, but there's still quite a lot of like academic research on the DV protocol itself and different things that, you know, can be like influenced and need to be taken into account. The first set of things I want to talk about are consensus-related research problems. So in our first version, what we've built today, it uses a synchronous and leader-based proof of consensus mechanism called QBFT. QBFT is pretty well understood. It's kind of a variant of IBFT that loses liveness. But one of the main downsides of it is because it's leader-based, if you have a slow person in there, or worse, an offline node, they keep getting a turn like once every 4 duties, and you have to wait for them to time out. And that's unfortunate because, you know, you're wasting precious time. Whereas if you had an asynchronous protocol or a responsive protocol where you can kind of make progress as fast as possible, adding in a slow validator or like a slow node operator doesn't hinder you the same way that it does in like a synchronous leader-based one or a partially synchronous leader-based one. So if we're looking for like, yeah, the DV protocol of the future, you probably want something that's more responsive and, yeah, sees no negative impact if you add somebody in like New Zealand really far away. You're like, cool, you know, either you work or you don't. It doesn't kind of negatively hinder me. Another aspect, and I think Joaquim kind of covered it a little, is attributability is a very important kind of feature that people would like in consensus. If in this instance with the distributed validator, you had, you know, more than the safety threshold of like dishonest nodes, you come to consensus on, you know, more than one thing, maybe more than one thing gets signed, you really want to figure out who is involved or give some kind of guarantee that at least 1/3 of the nodes are getting slashed, for example. Adding attributability to a consensus game is one of the kind of key features for the like unhappy path of kind of figuring out what happens in the worst case scenario. We've come to consensus on like dual things. So within this space, I think Eigenlayer have done interesting work on forensics of BFT is what they called it, but it was this figure like trade-off of can you identify everybody that kind of, you know, committed the fault? Can you identify up to a certain amount of them? This is the kind of things that we're looking at within the consensus realm. And another one that we talked about, even in the previous talk by Casper, was the idea of MEV and whether that will impact consensus. And I really enjoyed that I had the time to do quite a lot of time talking about honest assumptions or rational assumptions, because everyone assumes kind of honesty assumptions, but the rational assumption is kind of more likely. And what I'm getting at was to where MEV impacts consensus in a distributed validator context. If, you know, you're the leader, you're proposing a block, why wouldn't you just kind of like slide a bit of the MEV to some like third EOA that nobody knows about? And can you figure out if like you can get away with that before people know it? And the marginal defector is the one that kind of like earns this reward and stuff. And, you know, whether there's like a fix to this is kind of where the like enshrined PBS debate comes in. And can you separate the idea of like proposing rights and, you know, like, well, building the block and the actual proposing rights? This is something that I think is kind of needed for all validators and something that's been actively worked on the L1 more generally. So there's some of the consensus side improvements, but there's still quite a lot of other research aspects that we're looking at. Some of them being like danksharding. What is the most effective way for a distributed validator to, you know, agree on what is available and what's not? You don't want one bad actor to kind of pretend things are available that aren't actually, but you don't want to like recheck everybody's work and be completely inefficient about it. Is there kind of some middle ground where we can kind of all check the same things and have pretty good guarantees about availability without doing kind of unnecessary work? Another aspect that we spend quite a lot of time on is the key generation. So I didn't go into the 2 types of distributed key generations, but one is where you need to be part of the DKG to know it was honest, and the other is a publicly verifiable secret share. This is where anybody can check the proof to be like, yep, all of these people did the DKG honestly, so long as they're not like Sybil resistant, like Sybil attacking and all the same person. This is probably independent people with the keys. This idea of a PVSS DKG is kind of the gold standard for DKGs, and figuring out can we adopt one that is also provable at L1 in some way, shape, or form is kind of like what a lot of the liquid staking protocols would like to see for like really reducing the trust in people running a distributed validator. We also spent a decent amount of time trying to figure out, can this pattern make sense for sequencers at the L2 side? This is something that's a hot debate at the moment and a lot of people are quite involved in. And on the other side, one of the things we look at is key refresh scheme. A key refresh scheme is the idea that if you keep the same public key for your distributed validator, but once a day, for example, everybody picks a new share, and so long as you follow this protocol, we all end up on the right, new polynomial every day. And what's super powerful about that is then if you try and compromise private keys, you have to compromise 2/3 of the nodes all in 24 hours before they've done a resharing, and now they're all on a new set of keys, and you have to start the process of compromising them again. This can also go further, and it can be used for like operator rotation, where you can kind of rotate to a new set of private keys and leave behind someone that you didn't want involved because they weren't performing well enough, for example. And even on the kind of more quantum end of it, I know Justin Drake is very keen on like single shot signatures and whether you can do something like that for a validator. That would again make it much, much harder to compromise the private keys for a validator. So we've talked about now engineering challenges and how we design something that's kind of not too risky from a networking and privacy perspective. We've looked at some of the subjectivity and objectivity of data about DVs and whether we can kind of prove this to a smart contract cheaply. We then looked at some of the research challenges involved and like how we can improve consensus, adjust for dank sharding. Didn't mention secret leader election, but coming onto the more like human side of it, there's lots of coordination involved in distributed validators. And this is where I kind of want to circle back to moving safety risks to liveness risks and kind of mitigating liveness risks with multiple implementations. So if you have a well-working distributed validator solution, you now have private keys in many different locations. Even if it's compromised, it's not getting slashed. Like this really reduces the safety risks of kind of causing a double signing. But if you have one piece of software in every single stack, you still have a liveness risk where that software can go offline and you're not going to get slashed, but you don't want to go offline, particularly if you're like a large amount of the network. And this is where having a credibly neutral spec and multiple like well-tested implementations of it goes that bit further and says, yes, we've mitigated safety risks. Now we're kind of in the liveness space. We now have lots of different implementations. That's further reducing the liveness risks. We now have like really, really secure and like decentralized proof of stake. This effort is something that we've been kind of working on for quite a long time, but it's something that we've recently kind of kicked up a notch with the Nethermind team, where we began work on a distributed validator protocol. And this is at first a research and specification effort, and generally, an effort to build multiple implementations. But the goal here is to take in some of the things that I've talked about today, which is, good ways to design it from an architecture perspective, things we can do from like attributable consensus, trying to figure out if we can make something succinctly verifiable so we can prove it on chain, and generally make something that's, credibly neutral and that, can be the high availability software for all validators on Ethereum going forward. And that's kind of where we're working towards at the moment. I'll show you in a minute. We're making some of these posts available on our research forum this week, if not like in the next kind of couple hours. But to talk a little bit about making such a protocol, one of the things that I think is very synonymous with distributed validators is the idea of proof of work mining pools. Back in Bitcoin's kind of heyday, Bitcoin started in the start of 2009. Before the end of 2010, there were like CPU miners that were like, hey, there is no chance of me producing a block on my own with just a CPU. I need to like team up with other people, and together we'll be able to share the chance to like produce blocks and proof of work. Proof of stake we see is kind of going down a very similar avenue. For the first 2 years, anyone could get involved, and at this point it's getting like, extremely prohibitive on a cost perspective to kind of, produce blocks on your own. And people are starting to look at like, what is the fix here? Do we all go to DPoS and like kind of like delegate to somebody else? Preferably not. The goal is to have people involved in the proof of stake protocol, like no matter how small. And we see distributed validators as being that kind of analog to like mining pools. And mining pools haven't gone anywhere. They've been in operation for like 13 years. They extract revenue and they're like generally seen as a resource. But if you're early in Ethereum's proof of stake consensus kind of formation, and you're figuring out how do we want this equivalent to like mature, we want probably a spec, we want something credibly neutral, we want something that probably funds public goods and like funds the client teams that develop this software, because that's how it'll be like sustainable. We take a lot of inspiration from the likes of people like Optimism, and particularly this EIP 1890 that some of you might remember. Back in 2019, there was a proposal introduced to have proof of work mining rewards given to like a public goods Gitcoin like kind of matching pool. There was a lot of debate back and forward about whether this would be a good idea or not. And generally the kind of conclusion was that this would be too risky to put in the base layer because it might get kind of compromised. We see distributed validator protocols as kind of a sensible layer to be like, oh yeah, maybe this is where we do a bit of like funding of public goods. And as people go to use the software to like take part in proof of stake, maybe this can be somewhere that can, fund client development into the future and make Ethereum kind of more robust and decentralized. I'm kind of coming to the conclusion, and just before I do, I wanted to kind of give you an idea as to, as I said, there's no answers here. Most of this is kind of like research problems, questions, ways to get involved. So I would say if anything I've said today kind of interests you, I would say kind of consider joining our Discord community. You can test out these DVs on Girly or Mainnet if you're brave. You can kind of get in touch with us. The QR code beside it is a link tree, which is all of our kind of info. And kind of most importantly, we're hiring. We're hiring kind of researchers, Go devs, mathematicians, Solidity devs, product owners. So like we've quite a lot out there that I would recommend. But just lastly, before I kind of go on to a Q&A, in terms of kind of the order of operations around making distributed validators, some people maybe favor kind of making some spec first and then making implementation. My background is maybe more on the eng side than the researcher side. It felt more sensible to me to make a V1, like make an implementation, prove that it works, prove that it's real. And when it starts to get adoption and find product market fit, and people start to say, hey, we now need to kind of address these liveness issues, this is when you can start to kind of make this more forever protocol, and you can pick some of the more like kind of long-term changes and pick like a more out there consensus mechanism, a more out there DKG. And we see it a lot like how Ethereum was developed. They had this like plan for proof of stake from the beginning, but they were like, look, let's fork Bitcoin and add the EVM. Let's start with kind of the MVP, and we can work our way towards a spec and a protocol and proof of stake. This is something that we're trying to follow at Obol, which is kind of make an implementation, show that it's real, get people interested, get people like believing that DVs make a load of sense, and as it starts to kind of take off and find product market fit, work on this protocol, work on making it credibly neutral, work on getting like many independent specs and like implementations on, work on getting kind of like a feedback loop that will kind of keep this resilient and funded. And yeah, that's generally our goal, is to make a distributed validator protocol. Thank you very much. I'll take a question now if you want.
Questions?
Hi, I really enjoyed your talk. So validators run consensus, and distributed validator participants run consensus for each step in consensus. Do you foresee the need ever for distributed validator participants?
Need is a strong word. I've seen it done already in terms of people already have like high availability for their remote signers, which is like kind of the private keys behind it. So yeah, it's not the end of the world for there to be consensus on consensus on consensus. I wouldn't say there's a need per se, but this is the idea of how we get like an next order of magnitude scaling for consensus. The core layer has gone to like 1 million participants. That's super impressive. But if you want to keep going like further, you have 12 seconds, play a smaller game between it. And that's kind of how we see you go from like 1 million to 10 million participants in consensus. But would I say need for like a third layer? Not necessarily. Would I say it's done? Yeah, I think it will be done and has been done.
Thanks.
Yes, I wanted to also come back on this. You're changing the trust assumption underlying, right? You have one of the 128 validators that's now suddenly distributed.
Yes.
And why are not the distributed, say, among 10? Why these 10 are not participating in the main, as one of each one, a separate one, in the 128 set?
Because they generally can't afford to.
Sorry?
They generally can't afford to be part of like the main set. Like each of these 32 Ether is quite prohibitive. So it's
from
like,
the mining pool?
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
Hi.
A few more?
Yeah, if say someone today takes just say a Cosmos SDK, what is still missing? Like, can you just claim that's kind of a poor man's distributed validator before everything else from Obo is ready?
You can have, I would argue there's already that equivalent of like distributed validators on Tendermint in the form of like Horcrux.
Right.
However, Cosmos is slightly different in that because it's ED 25519, you can't just aggregate signatures. You have to have like quite an involved like MPC signing process. So distributed validators in the current Cosmos set have access to the private keys, which is a little scary if your like, client is compromised and they can sign whatever they want and get you jailed. If they were using something like homomorphically additive like BLS, you could have the kind of current design where it's much lower risk of like, if it is compromised, you're not like risking safety in the same manner. But yes, you could do this in like Cosmos as well.
Okay, good, thanks.
Last question.
Last one I go.
Cool, thank you. Great talk. My question is related to the topic of lazy validators.
Yes.
So let's assume we have one highly trusted, highly available data source with all the chain data, and all the other validators just kind of, they're lazy, so they proxy everything to that one highly trusted, highly available data source. You mentioned that you've heard people looking into BDFs and other approaches to try and solve this problem. And even though I don't expect there to be a solution, I'm curious what else you've seen, what other ideas you've seen floating around to try and solve it, maybe aside from just VDFs.
Nice, yeah. So you hit on one of the important ones, which is data availability. So in the happy path, when like 4 nodes are online, they can all kind of vote who's online and offline. And when you have consensus, that all works. If 2 out of the 4 nodes go offline, you no longer have consensus. They can't agree as to who is online and who is offline. So normally you need some sort of like data availability layer where you can be pushing these like partial signatures for cheap, and then some like external party can come on and say, well, I see all of these partials, and then eventually they go missing. That must be where it went wrong. And that's kind of one of the ways of having an external observer is like solving this data availability problem, having this trusted external place where you can like push all the partials. And then the other side, as I mentioned, is the VDF one, which is, people were online because they have VDFs to prove it. Don't want to waste too much time, but basically the idea is if you put the beacon state root, so like the tip of the chain, as a pre-image to your VDF, you could not have started the VDF until that was available. So if you're trying to backtrack and you're trying to like make up a 2-hour delay, you might be able to do so if you have slightly faster like hardware, but you can't get out in front because you don't have the beacon state root. So that kind of slows you down. So that's one of the ones that we can say, you can show up to the L1 with the VDF and someone can check that VDF and be like, cool, they definitely were online. They have like proofs of it. And that's, different to the data availability, like pushing things into data availability layer. But I'd argue they're the 2 main ones. So something like with the VDF and like a validity proof, or having like some DA layer and doing it like in a fraud-based way, getting a third party in to like check, and either like agree with the fraud claim or like not with the fraud claim. They're probably like the 2 main ones.
Okay, I'll follow up with some more questions later.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Okay.
let's continue offline and thank Øystein again.
Thank you very much. See you guys.
And we are adjourned and come back at 3:30 for the next session.